Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of European power, already knowing how this was supposed to end. By the early 19th century, he had broken coalitions, crushed field armies, and rewritten the tempo of continental war. Speed. Concentration. The decisive battle. The formula had worked, again and again. And yet this story ends not with a single catastrophic mistake, but with something far more unsettling. Napoleon did not lose because he stopped innovating. He lost because his greatest innovations hardened into doctrine. Why did a commander who once shattered every existing rule become trapped inside rules of his own making? Why did victories that once guaranteed political submission begin to produce only wider resistance? And why did each correct decision push his empire closer to systemic collapse? This is not a story about arrogance in the simple sense. It is a story about strategic success becoming a structural liability. And about a war machine that could no longer stop winning, even when winning no longer meant survival. This part answers one question before all others. What kind of war was Napoleon actually fighting, when his old methods stopped delivering closure? By the time Napoleon's system began to fail, Europe was no longer a collection of rival armies seeking a clean military verdict. It had become a layered conflict spanning coalitions, economies, populations, legitimacy, and time. The battlefield had expanded far beyond terrain. At the surface level, the alignment looked familiar. France versus a rotating coalition of continental powers. Armies maneuvering across Central Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, and eastern frontiers. Campaign seasons. Marshals. Corps. Supply trains. But beneath that surface, the objectives had shifted. Napoleon's true goal was no longer simply defeating enemy armies. It was preserving a system that required constant forward motion. His empire was built on redistribution, titles, territories, thrones, prestige, allocated through victory. Every campaign fed that machine. The coalition's objective was different. They did not need decisive victory. They needed Napoleon's system to exhaust itself. That asymmetry defined the war. The constraints Napoleon could not escape. Napoleon faced four binding constraints, each tightening with every campaign. First, geography. France's military power projected outward faster than its administrative depth could follow. As fronts widened, control thinned. Every new theater created longer supply lines, weaker local legitimacy, and slower political response. Second, time. Napoleon's model depended on rapid resolution. But coalition warfare thrives on delay. Every month without decisive closure allowed enemies to coordinate, rearm, and learn. Third, politics. Napoleon ruled not only enemies, but allies held by force, fear, or reward. The moment victory slowed, loyalty decayed. His empire contained too many stakeholders whose commitment was conditional. Fourth, economics. War funded war, until it didn't. Blockades, trade disruption, and prolonged mobilization turned France's advantage into a liability. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more the economic base strained under its own weight. These constraints did not appear suddenly. They accumulated quietly. And Napoleon continued to operate as if they were temporary obstacles, not structural limits. The coalition's advantage was not brilliance. It was patience. The opposing powers did not initially outthink Napoleon. They outlasted his assumptions. They learned three things. 1. Meeting Napoleon in a decisive battle was optional, and usually fatal. 2. Retreat was not weakness if it preserved the army and denied closure. 3. War could be shifted away from the battlefield and into logistics, legitimacy, and exhaustion. This learning curve mattered more than any single general. Avoiding battle forced Napoleon to chase. Chasing forced him to advance deeper. Advancing deeper increased supply dependency. Supply dependency magnified attrition. The coalition did not need to defeat his army. They needed to deny him the ending his system required. The Iberian fracture, when population entered the war. Nowhere did this shift become more visible than in Spain. The Iberian theater was not strategically central in a traditional sense. But it was systemically corrosive. Local resistance transformed territory into hostile infrastructure. Supply convoys disappeared. Occupation forces bled slowly. Every village became a censor, every road a risk. This was not conventional warfare. It was political resistance weaponized against a military system. Napoleon's model had assumed neutral or compliant populations. Spain violated that assumption completely. And the damage was not isolated. Resources diverted to Iberia weakened other fronts. Marshals tied down there were unavailable elsewhere. Morale eroded as victories stopped producing stability. This was not a failure of tactics. It was a failure of environmental assumptions. Russia was not the exception. It was the culmination. By the time Napoleon faced the Eastern Campaign, the strategic pattern was already set. Russia did not need to defeat Napoleon in battle. It needed to absorb him. Distance replaced resistance. Space replaced fortification. Time replaced firepower. The deeper Napoleon advanced, the more his advantages inverted. Speed outran supply. Concentration magnified scarcity. Decisive intent collided with strategic emptiness. This was not an ambush. It was structural exposure. And yet Napoleon continued forward, not because the logic was flawed, but because retreat offered no political solution either. That was the trap. Why retreat was not a neutral option? A conventional commander might disengage. Napoleon could not. Retreat without victory threatened his legitimacy. It signaled weakness to allies. It emboldened rivals. It disrupted the reward cycle that held his empire together. In that sense, Napoleon was not choosing between advance and retreat. He was choosing between delayed collapse and immediate collapse. So he advanced. Not because the decision was irrational, but because the system had eliminated safer alternatives. The enemy's hidden advantage, systemic alignment. The coalition benefited from something Napoleon lacked, distributed resilience. If one army failed, another remained. If one campaign stalled, the war continued. Losses were absorbed collectively. Napoleon's system was centralized. Its strength was coherence. Its weakness was fragility. Victory required synchronization. Failure cascaded. The coalition learned to fight a war that Napoleon's system was not designed to win. The strategic environment, summarized. By this stage of the conflict, Napoleon needed decisive victories to survive politically. His enemies needed only to prevent those victories from concluding the war. He needed speed. They needed time. He needed control. They needed disruption. He needed endings. They needed endurance. This mismatch, not any single battle, defined the outcome. And it created a cruel paradox. The more Napoleon relied on the strategy that built his empire, the more that strategy accelerated its breakdown. And inside that paradox, the old, correct way of fighting war became the most dangerous choice available. This section confronts the assumption that Napoleon simply misapplied his own doctrine. He didn't. He applied it exactly as designed. The problem was that the doctrine itself had stopped matching the war it was now fighting. What a normal commander would have done. A conventional European commander, facing widening coalitions and overstretched fronts, would have pursued three stabilizing actions. First, limit objectives. Fight to secure borders, not to reorder the continent. Second, avoid overextension. Preserve the army as a political instrument, not a consumable asset. Third, prioritize negotiation windows. Use battlefield success to force diplomacy before attrition sets in. This approach was cautious. It reduced exposure. And in most historical contexts, it worked. Napoleon rejected it entirely. Not because he didn't understand it, but because his system could not survive it. Why the standard approach was strategically impossible for Napoleon. Napoleon's empire was not defensive. It was expansionary by necessity. Every campaign did more than defeat an enemy. It redistributed power across Europe, crowns, titles, territories, prestige. Those rewards were not optional. They were how loyalty was maintained. A limited war would have frozen that mechanism. And a frozen mechanism would have exposed a dangerous truth. Napoleon's authority was inseparable from momentum. Stopping meant decay. So while doctrine suggested consolidation, Napoleon faced a deeper constraint. Consolidation did not stabilize his empire. It destabilized it. The decisive battle doctrine, what it actually assumed. Napoleon's approach rested on several hidden assumptions. That enemy armies would seek engagement. That populations would remain passive. That logistics could be improvised locally. That victory would compel political submission. In earlier campaigns, these assumptions held. They stopped holding, not gradually, but categorically. Enemies stopped seeking battle. Populations became active participants. Logistics became contested space. Political submission was replaced by coalition hardening. Yet the doctrine itself did not adapt. Why? Because its success had taught Napoleon that these assumptions were fundamental truths, not context-dependent variables. That distinction matters. When doctrine becomes identity. By this phase of the wars, Napoleon was not merely using a system. He had become identified with it. Speed was no longer a tactic. It was proof of superiority. Concentration was no longer a choice. It was a signature. Decisive battle was no longer one option among many. It was the validation of his genius. Changing doctrine would have meant questioning the very narrative that sustained his authority, to himself, to his marshals, and to Europe. That made adaptation psychologically costly. Not impossible, but dangerous. Why following doctrine became the riskiest option. Here lies the core contradiction. Napoleon's doctrine was designed to shorten wars. But when wars stopped being shortenable, applying that doctrine increased exposure. Speed amplified logistical strain. Concentration magnified attrition. Decisive intent drove deeper penetration into hostile systems. What had once reduced risk now multiplied it. Yet abandoning doctrine carried its own danger. Loss of confidence, loss of control, loss of legitimacy. Napoleon was caught between two unacceptable choices. Break doctrine and undermine the system that made him emperor. Follow doctrine and escalate systemic fragility. He chose the latter. Not recklessly. Rationally, given the constraints he faced. The illusion of correct decisions. From the inside, each step made sense. Advance to force engagement. Engage to secure decision. Win to restore order. The problem was not decision quality. It was decision framing. Napoleon continued to solve tactical problems inside a strategic environment that no longer rewarded those solutions. The doctrine was still coherent. It was simply misaligned. And misalignment, at this scale, is lethal. The moment doctrine stopped being a guide and became a trap. Once enemies learned how to avoid Napoleon's strengths, doctrine no longer offered flexibility. It narrowed options. It accelerated commitment. It punished hesitation. In effect, the system began selecting for its own failure. Napoleon was no longer asking, "What does this war require?" He was asking, "How do I force this war to end the way my system needs it to?" That shift is subtle. And it is fatal. Because when doctrine stops describing reality and starts demanding obedience, it ceases to be strategy and becomes inertia. This part answers the question most histories rush past. If the doctrine was failing, why did Napoleon double down instead of retreating from it? The answer lies not in blindness, but in constraint. This was not a sudden decision. Napoleon did not wake up one morning and choose risk. Risk had been accumulating around him for years. Each campaign narrowed his margin. Each victory raised expectations. Each redistribution of power tied more actors to continued success. By the time the strategic environment shifted decisively, his freedom to change course had already eroded. What emerged was not a reckless leap forward. It was a forced continuation. Who questioned the direction and why it didn't matter? Inside Napoleon's command structure, doubts existed. Marshals understood the strain on supply. Administrators warned about stretched finances. Political advisors recognized coalition fatigue. But the structure itself filtered dissent. Napoleon's system rewarded execution, not opposition. Success had trained his inner circle to optimize implementation, not challenge assumptions. Criticism did not disappear. It simply lost leverage. When outcomes are framed as matters of speed and decisiveness, hesitation becomes disloyalty. That dynamic mattered more than any single voice of caution. The core assumption Napoleon could not abandon. At the center of every decision was one belief. If the enemy army could be forced into decisive engagement, the war would still end. Everything flowed from that. It justified deep advances. It justified compressed timelines. It justified ignoring political exhaustion in favor of military opportunity. This was not ignorance. It was commitment to a premise that had once always been true. And abandoning it would have meant admitting that Napoleon's greatest advantage, his ability to impose conclusions, had expired. Why this decision was strategically unorthodox. By the standards of the time, Napoleon's choice was radical. He was not conserving force. He was consuming it to preserve momentum. He was not trading space for time. He was trading time for the chance of forcing closure. He was not adapting war aims downward. He was escalating pressure to keep the system intact. Most commanders would never accept that logic, because it assumes something dangerous. That escalation can substitute for adaptability. Napoleon accepted that assumption because his empire required it. What this decision actually targeted. This was not a gamble against enemy firepower. It was a gamble against enemy psychology and coordination. Napoleon was betting that the coalition would fracture under pressure. One decisive blow would overwhelm diplomatic cohesion. Fear of annihilation would force negotiation. In other words, he was not attacking armies. He was attacking the coalition's will to remain synchronized. That had worked before. The risk was that synchronization, once learned, is harder to break than to prevent. The hidden danger inside the decision. The decision carried a silent condition. It would only work if the enemy misread intent, avoided coordinated withdrawal, failed to weaponize space and delay. If any of those failed, Napoleon would advance into emptiness. And emptiness offers no decision. Only attrition. Only time. Only exposure. This was the real wager. Why there was no clean exit. Once committed, reversal became impossible. An advance demanded supply. Supply demanded control. Control demanded deeper advance. The strategy fed itself. And because the political cost of hesitation was immediate, while the military cost of advance was delayed, every incentive pushed forward. This is how rational actors lock themselves into irreversible paths. Not through error, but through alignment of pressure. The paradox at the heart of the decision. Napoleon's choice was unorthodox not because it broke doctrine. It was unorthodox because it refused to acknowledge that doctrine had lost authority over outcomes. He was forcing a strategic environment to conform to a logic that no longer governed it. And the more resistance he met, the more force he applied. Not to win faster, but to keep the system from unraveling. That was the moment the war stopped being about victory and became about postponing collapse. This section strips away intent and examines mechanics. How the strategy functioned once it left the map table, and why its internal risks multiplied faster than its gains. From concept to movement. On paper, the logic was clean. Rapid concentration of force. Forward momentum to deny enemy coordination. Pressure applied before resistance could stabilize. In practice, this required perfect synchronization. Corps had to arrive on time. Supplies had to move without interruption. Local resources had to remain accessible. Enemy forces had to behave predictably. Any deviation increased strain. Multiple deviations became catastrophic. Napoleon's system was not fragile because it was aggressive. It was fragile because it stacked dependencies. Speed as a liability, not an asset. Speed had once been Napoleon's shield. Now it became his exposure. March rates outpaced supply columns. Foraging replaced provisioning. Wear on horses, men, and equipment accelerated faster than replacement cycles. Each day of rapid advance borrowed from the future. And the bill always arrived later. When distance was greatest, and options were fewest. Logistics without depth. Napoleon's campaigns relied on a critical assumption. That territory could feed the army faster than depots could. This worked only under specific conditions. Stable populations, intact infrastructure, limited resistance. Those conditions vanished. Roads were sabotaged. Stores were destroyed. Local cooperation collapsed. What remained was logistics by improvisation. A system that works brilliantly at small scale and fails brutally at continental scale. The silent erosion of combat power. Losses did not come all at once. They accumulated invisibly. Men fell out from exhaustion. Units thinned without engagement. Command cohesion degraded as replacements lacked experience. By the time battle occurred, the army often arrived already diminished. This was not defeat by enemy action. It was attrition by environment. And attrition does not announce itself until it cannot be reversed. The first micro-twist, success that hid damage. In early engagements, Napoleon still won. Enemy units withdrew. Coalition coordination wavered. The appearance of dominance persisted. This was dangerous. Because success delayed recognition of structural failure. Each tactical win reinforced belief that the system still worked, even as its foundations weakened. Victory became noise. Failure became signal. But the signal arrived too late. Command under compression. As conditions worsened, Napoleon centralized control further. Decisions that once flowed through trusted subordinates now bottlenecked at the top. This increased responsiveness in the short term and reduced adaptability overall. Information arrived filtered. Bad news softened. Risk underreported. The system optimized for speed, not truth. The second micro-twist, momentum without leverage. At a critical point, Napoleon achieved what his strategy demanded. He forced contact. But contact did not produce closure. Enemy forces disengaged intact. Retreat preserved cohesion. The decisive moment dissolved. Momentum continued. But leverage vanished. The army advanced deeper with no political effect to show for it. This was the inflection point. The strategy had succeeded tactically and failed strategically. When execution traps the strategist. At this stage, stopping was no longer neutral. Supply lines extended too far. Retreat promised exposure. Allies watched for weakness. Napoleon faced a familiar illusion. Advance still looked like control. Withdrawal looked like collapse. So the advance continued. Not because it worked, but because alternatives appeared worse. The core operational failure. This was not miscalculation. It was misalignment. The strategy assumed pressure would force decision. Reality delivered. Pressure forced dispersion. The harder Napoleon pushed, the more the enemy absorbed, delayed, and redistributed impact. Execution magnified the very dynamics the strategy depended on eliminating. What actually broke first? Not morale. Not courage. Not leadership. What broke was temporal advantage. Napoleon lost the ability to decide when outcomes would matter. Time ceased to be a weapon. It became the enemy. And once time turned hostile, every further movement compounded loss. By the time Napoleon recognized the depth of this shift, execution had already locked him inside it. And now the only question left was how the enemy would respond, and where they would choose to break him. This part examines the most misunderstood phase of the conflict. Napoleon did not fail because his enemies suddenly became tactically superior. He failed because they learned which mistakes were acceptable and which were fatal. What signals the coalition received? As Napoleon advanced, the coalition saw three clear signals. First, he was still pursuing decisive engagement. Despite wider fronts and stretched logistics, his movements showed urgency, not caution. Second, his system required forward motion. He was not consolidating. He was accelerating. Third, withdrawal was politically dangerous for him. That made his behavior predictable, even when the battlefield looked chaotic. These signals mattered more than intelligence reports. They revealed intent. The coalition's initial misread. At first, the coalition misinterpreted momentum as strength. Rapid advances looked like confidence. Operational reach looked like dominance. Early successes reinforced old fears. This produced hesitation. Some commanders feared committing reserves. Others expected a crushing blow that never came. This delay was the coalition's mistake. And it nearly cost them. Why that mistake did not become fatal? Unlike earlier wars, the coalition no longer depended on perfect coordination. Their strategy tolerated inefficiency. If one army disengaged too early, another remained intact. If one front stalled, others continued pressure. This distributed resilience absorbed error. Napoleon's system could not do the same. His advantage required synchronization. Theirs did not. Learning in real time. As campaigns unfolded, the coalition corrected faster than Napoleon expected. They noticed a pattern. Whenever they avoided decisive engagement, Napoleon advanced deeper. Whenever they delayed, his logistics weakened. Whenever they dispersed, his concentration lost effect. This was not brilliance. It was adaptive learning under pressure. And once learned, it became doctrine. The strategic miscalculation that no longer mattered. The coalition still made tactical errors. Units retreated too far. Opportunities for counterattack were missed. Coordination sometimes lagged. But none of this mattered. Because the coalition had shifted the war's center of gravity away from battle outcomes. They no longer needed to win engagements. They needed Napoleon to keep moving. Where Napoleon misread their response. Napoleon interpreted avoidance as fear. He assumed dispersion meant weakness. He believed retreat signaled imminent collapse. That assumption had once been correct. Now it was lethal. Avoidance was strategy. Dispersion was insulation. Retreat was investment. Every kilometer Napoleon gained reduced his ability to exploit it. The decisive error was not tactical. The true break occurred at the level of interpretation. Napoleon believed he was shaping enemy behavior. In reality, enemy behavior was shaping his options. The coalition had accepted loss of territory. Napoleon could not accept loss of tempo. That asymmetry decided everything. The moment the advantage flipped, there came a point when coalition commanders understood something Napoleon did not. They did not need to stop him. They needed to let him continue. Advance became exposure. Momentum became obligation. Initiative became burden. From that moment on, Napoleon's choices narrowed with every step forward. Why the enemy's wrong responses still worked. From a textbook perspective, the coalition violated doctrine. They avoided battle. They surrendered ground. They accepted temporary losses. But they were solving a different problem. Not how to defeat Napoleon's army, but how to outlast Napoleon's system. That distinction mattered more than any maneuver. The strategic inversion. Napoleon had built his career on forcing opponents to fight on his terms. Now his opponents were forcing him to fight on theirs. Not through superior tactics, but through refusal. Refusal to engage. Refusal to conclude. Refusal to provide the ending his strategy required. By the time Napoleon recognized that enemy errors were deliberate, his campaign had already crossed the point where correction was possible. All that remained was the outcome, and the cost it would extract. This section closes the operational arc and opens the accounting. Not of glory, but of depletion. The immediate outcome. Napoleon did not lose in a single, decisive moment. There was no instant collapse that cleanly resolved the war. What followed instead was a progressive failure of leverage. Armies remained in the field. Command structures still functioned. The appearance of power lingered. But the system no longer produced outcomes proportional to effort. Victories failed to coerce. Movement failed to intimidate. Engagement failed to conclude. The war continued, without delivering decision. And for Napoleon, a war without decision was already lost. The human cost, force without recovery. Casualties mounted unevenly. Not through annihilation in battle, but through exhaustion, disease, desertion, and exposure. Men did not fall in dramatic waves. They faded out of the system. Units shrank quietly. Experience was replaced with numbers. Cohesion degraded without a single defining defeat. This was the most dangerous form of loss, because it was irreversible. An army can recover from a battle. It cannot easily recover from cumulative attrition without time. And time was the one resource Napoleon no longer controlled. The logistical cost, when momentum consumed capacity. Napoleon's operational speed had always relied on compression. Compressed marches. Compressed supply cycles. Compressed decision-making. As campaigns extended, compression turned destructive. Horses died faster than they could be replaced. Transport broke down beyond repair. Food scarcity became structural, not temporary. Logistics ceased to support operations. Operations began consuming logistics. Once that inversion occurred, collapse became a matter of sequence, not chance. The political cost, legitimacy erosion. Napoleon's authority rested on outcomes. As long as campaigns ended decisively, losses were tolerated. Requisitions were justified. Allies complied. When outcomes blurred, legitimacy fractured. Client states questioned loyalty. Allies hedged commitments. Neutral powers hardened positions. The coalition no longer needed to defeat Napoleon militarily. They needed only to wait until belief in inevitability evaporated. That moment arrived quietly. The psychological cost, decision-making under irreversible decline. Napoleon's final campaigns were not marked by confusion. They were marked by clarity without options. He understood the danger. He recognized the attrition. He saw the coalition adapting. What he lacked was a decision that could reverse momentum without destroying his political base. Every choice carried terminal risk. Advance deepened exhaustion. Withdrawal signaled vulnerability. Negotiation acknowledged parity. The strategy had eliminated graceful exits. That is the psychological price of overcommitment. If the strategy had failed earlier, had Napoleon's gamble collapsed quickly, history might have recorded a miscalculation. But it did not fail cleanly. It half-worked. Just long enough to drain resources, legitimacy, and recovery capacity. That prolonged degradation was worse than defeat. Because it destroyed not only the campaign, but the system that sustained future ones. The final accounting. Napoleon's downfall was not caused by ignorance or incompetence. It was caused by a strategy that demanded continuous success in a war no longer capable of delivering it. The cost was not one army. It was strategic flexibility itself. Once consumed, it could not be replaced. By the time the outcome became unavoidable, Napoleon had already paid the price, not for losing a war, but for winning too many under conditions that no longer existed. This final section strips the story of names, places, and campaigns. What remains is the strategic logic underneath, and why it still matters. This strategy was never about battles. At its core, Napoleon's late war strategy was not designed to win engagements. It was designed to force endings. Every movement, every concentration of force, every acceleration of tempo served one purpose: to compel the enemy into a political conclusion through military shock. That logic had once been revolutionary. What made it dangerous was not that it failed, but that it succeeded so thoroughly it became unquestionable. The rule it broke. Classical doctrine teaches that strategy adapts to context. Napoleon inverted that relationship. He attempted to make context adapt to strategy. As long as he could impose tempo, this inversion worked. The moment opponents learned how to deny tempo, it became fatal. The unorthodox nature of his decision lies here. He treated method as immutable, and environment as negotiable. History rarely forgives that reversal. Why this was not arrogance, but entrapment. It is tempting to explain Napoleon's failure as ego. That explanation is insufficient. Napoleon was trapped by a system he had built. His empire required momentum. Momentum required victory. Victory required decisive war. When decisive war ceased to exist as a reliable outcome, the system offered no safe alternative. This was not a man refusing to adapt. It was a system that punished adaptation. The deeper strategic lesson. The true lesson is not about Napoleon. It is about success-generated rigidity. When a strategy works repeatedly, it stops being evaluated. It becomes identity. At that point, feedback is interpreted as resistance, not information. Contradiction is treated as disloyalty. Adaptation feels like betrayal. That is how effective systems become brittle. Why the enemy didn't need to be better. Napoleon's opponents did not defeat him by matching his brilliance. They defeated him by changing the problem. They refused decisive battle. They weaponized delay. They turned endurance into advantage. They did not beat Napoleon's army. They outlived Napoleon's assumptions. That distinction matters more than any tactical comparison. The principle that survives this case. There is a principle hidden beneath this history. A strategy that depends on continuous success cannot survive a world that learns how to deny closure. When victory becomes a requirement rather than an outcome, strategy turns into obligation. And obligation eliminates choice. Why this remains a warning. Modern systems, military, political, organizational, still fall into this pattern. They mistake repetition for robustness. They mistake speed for control. They mistake escalation for adaptation. Napoleon's failure was not unique. It was early. Closing the file. Napoleon did not lose because he abandoned innovation. He lost because innovation hardened into doctrine. Doctrine hardened into identity. And identity hardened into a system that could no longer stop moving. In the end, the most dangerous thing Napoleon faced was not the coalition, not geography, not winter. It was a strategy that had once made him unbeatable and no longer knew how to end. Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered for how decisively he won. This story ends with why that decisiveness became a liability. His final failure was not tactical. It was not logistical in isolation. It was not even political on its own. It was structural. Napoleon built a system that converted victory into authority with unmatched efficiency. But that system depended on one condition remaining true: that wars could still be ended by force alone. When that condition disappeared, the system did not adapt. It accelerated. What followed was not collapse by shock, but erosion by continuation. Each campaign consumed options. Each success reduced flexibility. Each refusal by the enemy to conclude turned momentum into exposure. Napoleon did not misunderstand war. He misunderstood what war had become. His enemies learned something he could not afford to accept. That refusing decision could be more powerful than winning battles. That endurance could defeat brilliance. That systems built on speed are vulnerable to time. In the end, Napoleon was not defeated by a superior doctrine. He was defeated by a strategic environment that no longer rewarded decisiveness, and by a system that could not survive without it. This is why his downfall remains unsettling. Because it does not warn against recklessness. It warns against success. Against the moment when a strategy works so well that it stops being questioned, stops being tested, and starts demanding obedience from reality itself. History does not punish ambition alone. It punishes rigidity disguised as confidence. Napoleon's final lesson is not about how empires fall. It is about how they become unable to stop. And in the next episode of this series, we will examine another case where a powerful system did not lose because it was weak, but because it succeeded long enough to trap itself inside the logic of its own victories.